thanks to all the members for their hard work and total dedication, and the Bruce Reed and company staff, deeply appreciated. And to Erskine Bowles, my foxhole buddy, when the shells are raining down on my poor old bald dome. These are shocking things. I couldn't believe it. No, where were we? No, moving on. We will get something done in this commission, and I think the American people will be proud of it. Not to be said that the long-term denizens of D.C. will feel as much enthused as they might be, maybe even abused in the process. But just a word about this remarkable village by the Potomac, 36 square miles surrounded by reality. It's an interesting place. A note about our fine friend Andy Stern, now the subject of anonymous allegations and retribution from former fellow union members who used the electronic fog machine to shower material upon us all, to spread their venom. I felt the fang in their legs for about 35 years, but still walking. To say quite clearly that I think any person who uses an anonymous blog, say it quite clearly, is a jerk or a bonehead or a boob. Just a personal opinion. If you have something to say, say it. And tell who you are. Don't whimper and hide out. Democracy is not a spectator sport, but it's not a license to demean and denigrate and belittle those of us who are in the fray. While the creep who sneaks into the national debate by the subterfuge of anonymous and often bilious babble commands the allegiance of only the cynical, the disgusted, and the alienated in society. And the fellow zealot, of course, is also one who sits it out while the rest of us, like this 18-member commission, and millions of Americans try to make things work and lend their actual names to every cause as patriots and citizens, and not just nameless detractors. The only place in America for any democracy for the private and anonymous expression of a strongly and sincerely held view is the ballot box. That's the one, the only one. So take part or get taken apart, but do it up front, the American way. Thank you, Colonel. If you'll proceed.
I'm doing better.
Didn't have a thing to do with it, but got a lot off my chest. Gee.
If I could pick one partner, I'd pick Al Simpson. And for those of you here today that want to save Social Security, I can assure you that the one thing Alan Simpson talks about is simply making Social Security solvent for 75 years. You don't have to worry about Alan Simpson. I want to thank all of y'all for coming this morning and for the time and effort that all of you have put into this. It's taken a lot of time. It's taken a lot of energy over the last 5 months, and you all have really been supportive, and I deeply appreciate that. What I appreciate more than anything else is you have checked your party credentials at the door, and you've come in here in a totally nonpartisan manner to try to come up with some solid recommendations to bring this deficit down, something that we must do for this country. It is critically important. I think everyone that we've had testify agrees with that. We had the Fed chairman come in. We've had 6 CBO directors. We've had leading economists from both the right and the left. And we've heard from experts in every field over the last 6 months, and all have agreed that we must address this and we must address it now. All believe we have a fragile economy we must protect, but we have to bring down this deficit in the not-too-distant future. All have recommended to us that we reduce cost and spending across the board, whether we call it a tax expenditure, defense or non-defense spending, or mandatory spending of any kind. It's not going to be easy, it's not going to be fun, and in many cases it's also not going to be popular. It is going to require sacrifice on the part of all Americans to get there. So when you get back in November from the work you're going to be doing in your home districts, we've got some very tough decisions to make, so please keep your calendars open. This morning, we're going to have 3 presentations. The first dealing with performance budgeting, something that all of us in the private sector are certainly familiar with, and so are you in government. And we're going to talk about, secondly, reducing the overlap and duplication that exist in government. Our speakers this morning are Paul Posner, who is Director of Public Affairs Programs at George Mason. He'll discuss the opportunities we have to integrate performance information into the budget process. Before going to George Mason, he spent many years at the GAO, the Governmental Accounting Office, where he was a managing director for federal budget and intergovernmental issues. He will be followed by Pat Dalton and by Janet St. Laurent. Ms. Dalton is managing director of GAO's Natural Resources and Environmental Team, and Ms. St. Laurent is a managing director of GAO's Defense Capabilities and Management Team. We thank all 3 of you for coming and testifying today, and we'll start with Dr. Posner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the Commission for conducting this hearing today and recognizing that performance and budgeting are not oxymoronic, that in fact there are windows of opportunity that we have when we have major fiscal challenges like we're facing today to come to grips not only with the fiscal challenges we face, but with some of the performance challenges we face in government. I think the idea was best expressed by one former budget director who said, budgeting should be about going after weak claims, not weak claimants. And I always thought that was a good motto for budgeteers to follow, regardless of party. I think performance has become more prominent in our national debates, and certainly here inside the Beltway in Washington, and in states and in local governments and around the world, partly because of the growth of government. Government has become more important. It doesn't matter which administration and which party. And there's been a veritable agenda explosion that brings issues to Washington's doorstep with amazing speed. Private troubles increasingly become public problems to solve, whether it's distracted driving, out-of-wedlock births, or educating children for a future workforce. These are things that are dumped on your doorsteps and you have to face. In doing so, we've transformed government. Government is no longer about delivering the mail and even delivering the Social Security checks on time. Those seem easy by comparison. Now it's about cleaning up the Chesapeake Bay, protecting the ports from threats to Homeland Security, solving vexing traffic congestion problems, investing, making sure that all of us use low-carbon energy more than we're doing. To solve these problems requires not just government bureaucrats, but a whole range of people and sectors in our society, state, local governments, nonprofit, private sector. When you think about cleaning up the Bay, you're talking about the problems are distributed so widely. It's not just the big polluters, it's the farmers, it's the people who build shopping centers, it's the people who build new homes and new development, it's population growth that's really causing the Bay to be choked off. While these problems are widely distributed, you know, it's government's burden in some sense to be accountable for solving them, even though it doesn't have all the tools at its means or many of the tools in its means. So this is why we have a set of problems where the solution to problems is highly decentralized, but the blame is highly centralized. And that gives rise to, you know, questions. Well, if you're going to be managing or if you're going to be in the Congress, you got to focus on how can we improve the value that we're getting for our money. Increasingly, we're holding leaders accountable, and as this slide shows, leaders of both parties have kind of articulated the same basic objective, whether it's President Obama or President George W. Bush. They've all pledged before they came into office to ferret out these weak claims and to really examine the performance of government and make sure that we kind of take this responsibility seriously. And I think in some ways what I'm going to talk about and run through some slides here with you today is one of the success stories in government. We don't talk about many of our success stories. We talk more about the problems. But in fact, in the past 20 years, we have, regardless of party, increasingly focused on performance, collecting better information, holding agencies accountable, and increasingly thinking about the way we make decisions in performance terms. And I think that's something that has penetrated throughout our government, as it has, as I say, throughout the world. In some ways, when you look at the history of what we've done here, it breeds cynicism. It seems like we've keeps pushing this rock up the hill, and we can't quite get it right. We have one initiative after the other, starting with the Hoover Commission, planning, programming, budgeting, management by objectives, et cetera. And it certainly is a checkered history, if you will, kind of a zigzag, but nonetheless, the trend is up. And the fact is that national leaders are not willing to just let a single effort kind of fall by the wayside. They want to strengthen this. And so I think there is a movement upwards, and there's something compelling about...
Dr. President, could
yes,
I
I'm sorry, I should have said feel free to interrupt. I know you will, but...
Just a, these sort of things have been talked about for a long time, right. Correct? Mm-hmm. Decades, maybe scores of years.
Absolutely.
In the private sector, to Erskine's earlier point, this happens all the time. It's just the normal course of activity. Every year you say, how do I do more with less? Right? It's just the way it works. Right. But it never happens here. Despite all the discussion we have about increasing the effectiveness of government, it always seems like, here's the description I would use. In the private sector, if somebody had 1,000 people today and they had to do 10% more next year, they come in saying, I need 1,000, budget for 1,000, I need 100 more people, and I need the inflation for all 1,100. Whereas in the private sector, we would say, okay, that's 1,000, you have 100, so that's 1,100. I need 150 worth of productivity, so now you have 950 people to get this all done. That just doesn't seem to happen here. Why is that?
Well, there's several reasons. One is that, you know, the private sector has a pretty strong, compelling goal, which is to improve net income and profit. That's a bottom line that is understood. There's a metric that you can buy into, and you can understand how all the investments play into that. And government, if you take a single program, we have many conflicting objectives. I mean, we want the IRS to collect as much revenue as possible, but not bother taxpayers. We want the Forest Service to cut down lumber to feed the wood industry and protect the spotted owl and protect the God-given right of every American to ski on federal land. I mean, how do you balance those objectives? And moreover, if we're talking about some of the things that we're increasingly taking responsibility for, it's not clear whether adding 20 people or 100 people is going to solve the problem, because you're not essentially responsible for the problem. You're trying to incentivize people throughout the country, you know, state and local governments, homeowners, and the like. You think about how do you prevent wildfires? You say you're the Forest Service. You know, that's not a simple production function. It's not an input-output equation. You know, it's getting people to kind of start locating their homes in different places, in possibly less attractive places. It's fireproofing and changing the way we build homes. And it's getting insurance companies to start penalizing people if they put their homes in harm's way. There are some communities in this country that put a big X on the driveway if homeowners have not fire-safe their homes. And they literally, at least they say, they don't offer the same level of fire protection. I mean, that's the level that we're talking about here. National government has responsibility, political leaders here in Washington. The question is, it's a very complex set of problems we're taking on here. So I think that gets to part of it. We don't agree on all the different goals we have, and we really sometimes don't know how to do it.
But if I could just build on that a little bit, even in the private sector, for example, I would never tell people that you need to cut costs, be more productive, and that's at the expense of quality, delivery, or anything else. The point we always make is a success is achieving two seemingly incompatible goals, right? So yes, I want lower inventory, but I expect better delivery. I expect lower costs, I expect better quality.
Right.
That just doesn't seem to happen here. And even with all of your suggestions, which I had a chance to go through, all good, but how are they ever going to happen? What do we need to change in terms of the dynamics of the budgeting process, how the executive branch executes? What do we have to fundamentally change to make any of this stuff ever happen?
Right. Well, those are excellent questions, and I think you're right. The world is not simple in the private sector either, and I understand there are trade-offs there. But I think part of it is just getting better at knowing what we're trying to do and measuring it. I mean, there's a supply problem. And then once you've built that bridge, getting decision makers to use it. And frankly, that's been some of the problem, because we have different things we want from government, and reducing costs is only one of them. That's why I think windows of opportunity like you're dealing with provide, in some ways, that discipline, that a private corporation faces when they're facing competition. I mean, that's what really motivates private corporations to keep keep on their toes. And I think we're at that point in government now. Certainly, we're at that point in state government and local government, and now I think that storm is coming here. That we now face those same set of pressures. I think that could possibly, as we've seen in other countries, provide the source of motivation.
Dr. Rivlin and then Senator Conrad.
Well, just two other points. Private sector people like Dave tend to think of the government as though it were one thing. And somebody like a CEO was sitting there making decisions. 2 points, really. One is, sometimes that's true, and actually, if you look at what's happened to the government workforce over time, as it took on more and more jobs, as Paul was saying, the government workforce has not increased. And it is doing more with less people, partly because of contracting out. But the other point is there is the Congress. And if you really, one of the conflicting objectives is we want this plane that will do all these things for least cost, but we also want it to make jobs in a lot of people's districts. And those are incompatible objectives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Senator Conrad.
I remember having a professor in business school who said, you can't manage what you can't measure. And we have a real lack of metrics. And just in going through some of your material and knowing your work, you're very into metrics. And that's what we need. And, we were having a conversation in one of our last meetings. Senator Coburn and I got into an exchange on the Defense Department. You literally do not have an accounting system that allows you to manage that department. Because they, as we heard from our defense expert who was here several weeks ago, they can't tell you how many contractors they have. In fact, we asked them for a range, you may recall, and they told us the range was 1 to 9 million. That's a pretty big range.
I think that's that's right. I mean, there's two sides to this equation. One is the benefits we're trying to deliver, which are often very difficult to measure, and we've seen the debates on No Child Left Behind. What are we trying to measure in school performance? Well, that's a big debate. There is no national agreement on that. Certainly not at the top. The second is costs. I mean, federal agencies, spend what they're budgeted, but unlike the private sector, there's very little attempt to do cost accounting, where you take all the indirect costs and all of the fringe benefits, and you associate that with a program. You say, here's the total cost of achieving these objectives. We generally don't do business that way in government. Those costs are segregated in different budget accounts, and then you leave it to some poor analyst to try to kind of pull it all together in a spreadsheet. But we don't really budget and provide incentives for managers to manage that way.
Senator Baucus?
Like a lot of challenges, and I think Alice Rivlin kind of put her finger on it a little bit. We tend to take on the whole subject at once instead of dividing it up into discrete parts and portions. Because some of those discrete parts we can deal with more easily than some others. Tied into what Senator Conrad said about lack of metrics, I do believe that there are some areas that you can measure where metrics do work. Other areas where metrics is really tough because this is public policy as opposed to making more Honeywell products. And one for me is that I pushed on the Finance Committee is the administration's pledged to reduce, to double exports over the next 5 years. The goal is to double exports over the next 5 years. Well, you can measure exports and you can measure 5. So I've been pushing the administration whenever they come before the Finance Committee to give me benchmarks, give me a timeline to show us the degree to which we're accomplishing that objective this year, next year, the following year. And I have found at hearings that I run into resistance even there. I mean, without naming names, I asked them, what are your benchmarks? What are your quantified measures? You think where you will show the degree to which we're going to double exports in the next 5 years? And they don't know. So I force them to. I say, I want you to come back for our committee, every 6 months to tell us what they are, and next year, 6 months later, and so forth. My main point being, there are some areas I think we can quantify and measure, and should be in the federal government, and that will help, but it's tough to do it everywhere.
Well, if I could, I think what you just did, Senator Baucus, is exactly how we make progress. It's getting oversight up here. That I mean, one reason we don't, many agencies, certainly 10 years ago, GAO would go knocking on the door of the Department of Energy or at NASA, and how many federal employees you have? You know that to the person. How many contractors? Well, geez, it could be anywhere. It got to the point where GAO had to try to estimate it, and the reason is nobody asked them. There was no concern. You have to have the count of employees because you have FTE limits in your appropriations. Appropriators hold you accountable for your onboard strength. They don't hold you accountable, and nobody really budgets for contractors that way. So until the kinds of questions change and we really understand how we're doing business, and Congress gets into the game, which is the theme of my bottom line here ultimately, I think Congress needs to get more into this game of performance.
My experience having managed in the private sector and the public sector and having managed at both the state and the federal level, that there is less emphasis here on goals, objectives, and timelines and real accountability. There's more emphasis on the incremental spending rather than on the continuation budget, which is the big part of what you're really spending. And third, the definition of what is a cut is very different here and in state government than it is in the private sector. Here, if you get an inflationary increase, if you're spending $1 trillion and you get a 5% inflationary increase and you cut it back $25 billion, you've had a cut, whereas we would consider that an increase in the private sector. So a lot of it's cultural, and a lot of it is a different focus here than in the private sector. Two very, very different places to manage, I assure you.
And I started my career in the New York City Budget Office, and we were the home for performance measurement. We spawned a lot of it. And one of the things you learn at the local level is you're responsible for delivering the garbage, and you have total control over that function. That's pretty easily measured. You know how often you can do it and what the quality should be. When you're at this level, you're sometimes 5 or 6 steps removed. You have many different hands in the pie, and with very ambitious and difficult goals. That's a big part of why there's a difference here than there is down there.
If I could, I'd like to build on a point that both Senators Baucus and Conrad made, and that's on the service metric of some kind. Because I would say, even in business, we don't just run into what's the quality of the product. There are more subjective things that you have to try to measure, and I'm a big believer, and we have this discussion all the time, It's not just about cost. You also have to measure effectiveness. So to just give you an example, and something that I think is a concept that's probably usable here, our HR people, our human resources people, they used to measure the speed in which they filled a new job, okay, which seems like it makes sense, because you want jobs filled more quickly if you have an open position. But then you start the discussion about, well, wait a minute, how do you know that's a quality person, right? Because at the end of the day, what you're really looking for is very good people very fast. So then you enter the conversation, well, you know, how do you measure that? That's impossible to measure. Well, what we came up with is a survey at the 3-month and 12-month point after a new hire, where you survey the manager and say, are you happy with the person that we helped you get? Now you end up with a quality metric, a performance metric on something that was considered unmeasurable before. And what you end up doing is saying, yes, that actually does get better over time, and people start focusing on both. So I think there may be more opportunities, even if it's surveying your customer base. Right? Somebody's unhappy with their postman. If you just do a statistical sample, for example, of an electronic survey of people who want to participate, are you happy with your guy? With the firefighters, maybe you survey fire departments and say, what do you think of these guys? I can't imagine there isn't a way to start coupling effectiveness with cost in a way that we don't today.
And I think that's the spirit of this movement, is to start focusing not on the inputs and what you do when you come to work every day. It's what outcomes are you achieving. And I have a couple of examples a little bit later. On the Coast Guard, for example, that maritime safety is their responsibility. All they used to collect data on is how many inspections they did. Then they realized we don't have any idea of how many deaths we're averting. You know, what's the rate of death in the maritime industry? And when they started collecting that data, they realized, my God, we're not going after this in the smart way. We need to start training rather than inspecting, because it's people not knowing what they're doing is causing the big problem with tugboats accidents and things like that. Had a huge reduction in accidents and death as a result of that.
Actually, this is a hot button for me, so, but Einstein, I thought, said it pretty well, is that not everything that's important is measured, and not everything that's measured is important. That's right. And when you think about if you're measuring number of inspections, that's really irrelevant to what it is you're trying to get done. And putting some thought into whatever cost you're putting in, what objective are you trying to achieve, and find a way to measure that, no matter how difficult, that's where the opportunity is.
Okay. I'll go on here. I'm not going to cover every single slide. This pretty much reiterates the point that there's been a historic shift in budgeting from a focus on inputs, dollars, people, and accounts, to a focus on outputs and outcomes as government has become more critical to the national life. And this is true at all levels of government. A little bit about what do we mean by performance budgeting and why are we even talking about performance budgeting. And I think one of the things that we've learned from the past is that if President Johnson waves a wand in 1967 and says every agency shall do a performance plan and do benefit cost analysis, and it wasn't linked to the budget, after about 10 weeks, the bureaucrats don't pay attention. The same with Nixon's MBO, Management by Objectives. Great high-minded programs, good government. It's not linked to the one process that people pay attention to. And if people up here don't buy in, those two things are critical. These things become one-year wonders. But if you get it linked to the budget and you have it anchored in a congressional statute with strong oversight, then you can have something like we've had the past 20 years, which is performance becomes a sustainable part of the management agenda. So that's why we started realizing we have to link performance and budgeting partly to better budget as well as to improve the sustainability of these initiatives. And this kind of starts to put a little bit of meat on the bones. What do we mean by performance budgeting? And when you look across the country and other nations, there's kind of a kind of graduation of degree of difficulty, if you will, in what we're talking about. The easy thing to do is presentations, and we have, if you look at the huge volumes of federal budgets and documents, we have lots of performance data in those documents. That's kind of almost a no-brainer. The next question is, you know, what basis are you going to use to make decisions? What's the fundamental orientation of your budget and appropriation accounts? Are they salaries and expenses and construction and number of field offices, or are they some kind of results? That's much more difficult. and we haven't really made much progress in this country, and at least at the national level. Other countries like France, Italy have significantly overhauled their budget accounts to focus on performance. We haven't done that yet. Then you talk about the next stage would be setting targets for managers. And I have a slide here that I'm going to, let's see, I'm going backwards. Okay.
Can I come back?
It's, well, I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, but I was, that Great Britain has, for many years, had something called a public service agreements with its agency managers. And this is an example of what their health department public service agreement was. And so here what they're saying is, we're going to give you a budget, for a certain, dollar amount, and we're going to expect these kind of improvements in life expectancy for the next 3 years. Agencies get a 3-year budget in Great Britain. And we're going to expect real changes and improvements in death rates from disease, et cetera. And those are laid out in a contract. And theoretically, if you don't achieve it, obviously you have a lot of explaining to do. Now, a lot of that is not controllable by government. They should be given credit because they've reached for these outcomes, and they've really tried to change the basis of accountability. Well, that's performance targeting. We don't do that, by and large, in this government. We don't set budgets based on link to targets and hold people accountable for those targets. Getting back to the previous slide here, which I'll get to in a minute. So so that is, we haven't reached that. Performance-linked funding. That's probably the biggest challenge and maybe the most difficult, which is, can I make my budget figures linked to performance in some formulaic way? In other words, if I improve performance, I'm going to give you more money. If I reduce performance, I'm going to give you less money. That's a much more challenging concept, and it may work in the private sector. If I have Kmart, for example, has opportunities to expand, and they have a new business that's thriving in Burke, Virginia, then you want to put more money into that. That becomes a profit center. You want to reduce the costs. In government, it doesn't work that way. In government, often, if we have problems with a program, the number of drug abusers go up, we don't cut drug treatment programs. We usually increase them. So government has a very different model for how it budgets than the private sector. And the last last form of performance budgeting is assessments, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. Going back and looking, as you said, Mr. Chairman, about the base. What are we really getting for our money, and doing some organized systematic assessment. So I'm going to talk about what I think are the keys to making this, if we were to do performance budgeting, how would we do it? And there's 4 basic success factors. One is defining expectations. 2 is addressing the structural alignment. In other words, making the budgets and performance plans align with each other. 3 is increasing a supply of credible measures and outcomes. And 4 is promoting demand. Those 4 things is what it's going to take to really institutionalize performance budgeting. And I think we have a long way to go in all of them, basically. The expectations is something that very frequently public officials, particularly up here, think that we can take politics out of budgeting by doing performance budgeting. And that's the furthest thing from the truth. Yeah. Furthest thing. Actually, once I start budgeting for performance, the conflicts can get more intense. I mean, you're only going to achieve this much infant mortality reduction versus this much. I mean, but the point is, many people are kind of believe that once we have performance measures, we should just automatically budget. So when your program improves, you should get more money. Well, I just illustrated with the drug abuse. That's not a realistic model for government. Budgets are really a function of performance and needs and equity and a lot of other judgments, and they inherently will always be that way. So I think what's more realistic is to say, can we make performance be part of the discussion? Not the driving decision rule, but can performance become part of the way we think about budget choices? I think that's the choice we have. And then to do that, we have a couple of tasks we have to do. One is what I call building the supply chain, creating plans and measures and and outcomes that are credible and that are linked to the budget accounts. And there, I think we're part of the way there, but with Government Performance and Results Act. And that's what we started in 1993, and really that's the basis for everything we've done since. And that has been sustained at the agency level, and it is, again, I think, one of the success stories in government. And as I illustrate with these examples, just because of GPRA, there's been real significant changes at the agency level. Not in Congress. We, up here, not much attention's been paid to the performance plans. But the agencies have used these performance metrics to improve the way they manage. I talked about the Coast Guard before, reducing marine accidents by being more systematic about the outcomes they were trying to achieve. The Veterans Health Networks is another good example. They have health networks throughout the country. They were able to pilot best practice in cardiac surgery and apply those practices to all of their health networks and achieve significant reduction in cardiac morbidity. Now, what was important was they first had to measure cardiac morbidity across their hospitals. They hadn't done that before. So that's the first step. Having done that, they were then able to kind of, research and analyze what works, evaluate, and then apply that to the way they manage. And we really got some improvement. So GPRA has not only produced a pile of reports and plans, it's actually improved performance in selective areas.
Sorry,
Yeah.
another question for you. These are some good examples. One of the things that, if this were occurring in Honeywell, for example, if this was something I wanted to do, I would look for a business or a plant that had comprehensively done it well and look at that as a best practice and then just kind of measure everybody against, okay, how closely are you getting to that? As you look through all this, is there any agency or sub-agency or whatever we'd call it that you would point to and say, these guys get it, and they've really been doing this, and if we could just have the rest of the government do it the same way these guys are, we'd have something. Do we have something like that, a best practice place?
Well, we don't have a best practice institution that kind of systematically analyzes these things. GAO does some work like that. But particularly, I think the Coast Guard and VA have really, and NHTSA have really, led the way in some sense for federal agencies. They take this seriously. They use it to manage their employees and their programs. I mean, there's other examples too throughout government that we could point to. But I mean, the Park Service, for example, for years never collected any data on its 300 and some parks. As a result of this, they started collecting data on visitors and on environmental issues and whatnot, and now for the first time they're managing parks centrally rather than having fiefdoms in each park. That's a significant accomplishment. So I think, there's not one place, and there's not a shining star. I think there's a number of places that have done different things.
There's an example in the federal government of administration of grants where it's done well, and that's library grants and museum grants. Those people follow to a T best practices. There isn't a grant that goes out that doesn't get followed up. Every one of them they have 100% follow-up. They, according to the grant, they withhold money if people aren't. In other words, they're actually actively managing the grants, and it's the only place in the federal government where we actually do it. So there's a best practice that's happening right now where they are infinitely better than everybody else who administers grants. And if they can do it, everybody else can do it, but we're not making them do it.
Okay. Now GPRA built the bridge, the supply chain. The question is, who's going to walk across that bridge and use this information? And that's been the real problem. The Bush administration, to its credit, developed this PART tool, Program Assessment Rating Tool. It rated every major program in the federal budget, and it raised the salience of this issue, and it, as a result, almost forcibly injected performance into the executive formulation process. Not the Congress, the executive formulation process. So they changed performance from a tool for agencies to manage to a tool for OMB to use in budget formulation. That wasn't a significant achievement, but had some side consequences. One is, it really wasn't information that Congress had accessible to it, and Congress didn't feel they were in that game. Congress never felt engaged, in fact, actively resisted in some cases. So that became a significant problem, as well as, kind of doing performance on individual budget accounts. They kind of didn't look at the bigger picture, cutting across some of these budget accounts, where we're trying to achieve job training across 80 programs or whatever it is. The PART tool wasn't really well suited for that. But nonetheless, it continued to move the ball forward. And this is just an example of the PART scores that gradually improved over time. Some people say they improved because agencies got better at taking the test. The question is, did it improve really the way programs were managed? I think one of the things you can say is there was a tremendous fear on the agencies of being shamed. And shame is a powerful inducement in government and elsewhere. And as a result, agencies devoted more resources to getting their act together, particularly on evaluation, than they ever did before. Now we're at the Obama administration. They've backed off from PART. They've been much more selective. They have what they call the high priority performance goals. Agency has select numbers of goals. Examples are up there on the screen. These goals are then monitored quarterly by OMB. One of the important things that's just happening is the House has passed legislation, and the Senate is marking up legislation today in the Governmental Affairs Homeland Security Committee that would institutionalize, that would put this high priority goals into law and require agencies to do these, and require OMB to establish a set of federal government-wide priority goals, which I think is very important. Our experience here with this kind of long-lasting focus on performance, just to give you a little insight on the other countries, OECD has done some studies that show many nations have been at this for years and years, more than 10 years, just like us. And just like us, the use of performance, I apologize, this chart is a little vague to read. For the most part, most agency budget offices say they use performance to inform, but not to mechanically determine budget allocations, which I think is the right answer. And as this chart shows, hardly any governments throughout the world, the advanced world, are using performance data to eliminate programs, by and large. I've already gone over this. Let me just, one of the exceptions to that is when nations are in fiscal trouble. Canada, the Netherlands, Australia, they turn to something called program review, which is what I want to get back to in a minute when I go at the end. And program review, they do that baseline review you were talking about. They take groups of programs and they examine those weak claims, and they look at performance, and they look for opportunities for savings. Going forward, what are the challenges? Well, basically, I've listed some of them there. I mean, and we've talked about some of them already. To really make performance more of a part of the way we budget, we have to, first of all, get support and agreement on the goals. We have to find better ways to link what government does to outcomes. We have to fundamentally build support among non-federal actors because they're critical to achieving anything we do in government. And most importantly, we have to get Congress in the game. And I want to just show this one slide, which I developed when I was at GAO, which illustrates the performance cube, as we call it. That really, most programs these days are managed in a three-part way. One is the management and performance delivery are a function of how well the agency is managed. That's the right-hand side. How well is the agency bureaucracy managed? But then, two, what kind of partners are they relying on, and how well do the partners buy into the federal goals and the like? And we've seen some significant cases where they don't. We tried to implement Real ID across the states, and most states just said, not on my block, you're not. And then the tools that we use. We use a range of tools: direct spending, grants, contracts, loans, tax expenditures, and the like, regulation. And all of that goes into making a well-managed program. Very difficult to pull off. I'm going to talk now just a bit about the, as it was kind of the final point, how can we work here in the Congress to build a more strategic focus where we look more at budgets across program areas as they affect broader mission goals. and I call this a strategic approach to budgeting. The way we're structured here in Congress inhibits trade-offs across programs achieving common goals, whether it's higher education, which I'll show you an example, or food safety, or a variety of other things that I know my colleagues at GAO are going to talk about. We don't do that very well in our government, and certainly in the Congress. And yet, and we certainly don't have much incentive to examine the base. We do examine at the margins. And so the question is, can we, as either part of your process or going forward in the future, create a part of our budget process, if you will, that focuses on the higher level of what we're trying to achieve and all of the different tools that we're using to achieve those goals. Part of that is not only talking about spending programs, but tax expenditures, which this chart shows in the red line now exceeds discretionary spending. Total revenues we lose from tax expenditures now exceed discretionary spending. And for the most part, these tax expenditures are functionally equivalent to outlays. We achieve common goals through subsidies. Sometimes we administer them, sometimes we provide them through the tax code. An example of this is the housing portfolio from a CBO report, and you can see just the tax expenditures for home ownership far outweigh the spending for home ownership. On the other hand, spending for rental housing outweighs tax expenditures. So these ratios differ, but most programs or most policy areas are portfolios of programs. I'm going to skip over some of the detail here. The same is true with the education budget function, which is a rich array of different tools, discretionary, mandatory, loans, and tax expenditures. And when we look at one area and drill down, the federal higher education subsidies, we're throwing a lot of things at higher education to promote affordability and accessibility. And GAO has done some work that show that these things are not only not thought through together or coordinated, but they create significant problems for the consumer. 27% of Americans, for example, don't take the tax credits that they're eligible for. And there's offsets. You can be, if you take the tax credit, you have to count that against the income you're eligible for the Pell Grants, for example, and vice versa. So there's tremendous kind of leakage that happens in this system. To make matters more importantly, there has been no evaluation done of the higher education portfolio or even major programs to understand how do they affect accessibility to higher education, how do they affect graduation rates, how do they affect employment ultimately. Those are the goals we should be achieving. We don't collect that kind of data. We don't do those kind of studies. And we also have found that while we're providing higher education assistance at the front door, at the back door, universities are raising tuition as a result of this. So in some ways, we're undermining our goals because the actors we're using, don't necessarily share our goals. I'm in a university. I understand how that works now. Didn't before. So what we might be looking for, I'll end here, is a way for Congress to kind of develop a leadership agenda, if you will, where either as part of the budget process or possibly separately, you take a portfolio, whether it's housing, whether it's higher education, several a year, and this is what we've seen other nations do, and you drill down, and you look at all the tools that are in part of that portfolio, and then you try to drive that through the congressional budget process, which requires a more centralized budget committee, admittedly. And you try to kind of do some kind of a process where you get all the committees to do a joint kind of set of oversight hearings, coming up with recommendations, and possibly even a reconciliation bill that's performance-based. This is the kind of thing that Arizona did in the early part of the 2000s, where they took a couple of areas every year. One year was juvenile justice. They had all their committees focus on that area. How can we improve performance in that area? And there was a leadership push to get that done. And I think that's what we need from the Congress, to start driving performance at the level that it really matters, which is at these broad missions that we're trying to accomplish.
The states are being forced to do that because of budget situations. As an example, in North Carolina, no longer do you get funding just for enrollment growth. You have to meet specific retention and graduation goals. You have to meet goals of the number of baccalaureates per cost of producing the baccalaureate as compared to what your peers are doing, and are you making progress or not making progress? And again, historically, what they did is if you were it was all access and nothing about productivity and outcomes.
Right. Well, I know that must be an interesting process, having been in a university, how that plays out. But that's exactly right. I think the point you're making is fiscal necessity sometimes forces you to do things to change the way the game's played.
Yeah, in my experience, it's almost no different than a leveraged buyout. As another example, you know, I had two universities come to me, and they both wanted to add additional classrooms. I asked the question, well, what's your current utilization? And we actually, as Dave was just saying, we collected that data, but nobody ever looked at it. And when we looked at the data, we saw that one was at a 20% utilization and one was at a 60% utilization. Neither got the money. But you have to, you know, we were forced to make, because we had to look at throughput, just like any other organization does, before we awarded the resources.
Right. Right. Yeah. Okay, I think I'm going to stop there in the interest of time, because I know we have a lot of things that you want to get done. I don't know if there's other questions or issues to talk about with performance, but
Well, if I could go back to
Yeah.
the beginning, because
Yeah.
personally, I like everything that you had to say about this whole idea of looking at what are you measuring outcomes, and not outcomes that are easily measured, but rather what are you actually trying to get done. I like the whole idea. If I could, though, getting to your last pages on making it an agenda, all the different sub-functions, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
What would you suggest to all of us we actually do here? What has to fundamentally change? How do we change it so that this becomes a part of, because you can't just tell everybody, okay, now do it. It doesn't work that way, especially when you've got this institutional inertia that's been built up over decades. What should we actually do or recommend to make something like this happen? Beyond just saying everybody needs to have a performance objective.
Right, right. Well, I mean, I think what it involves is, on a selective basis, taking a couple of areas, and this is what we've learned in other countries really works when you have the fiscal heat on, and an incentive to do this, taking a couple of policy areas, whether it's higher education, whether it's housing, or whatever kinds of issues are important to the Congress, and having the Budget Committee kind of become, just because they cover the whole waterfront, you know, in some sense, and organize a review, like a program review, like we've seen in other nations, of those areas, in concert with the other committees of the Congress, and possibly setting some kind of targets for spending cuts and tax expenditure cuts in those areas as well, that would then be enforced through a reconciliation, like a performance-based reconciliation process. I mean, I've long thought that we ought to think about moving toward a performance resolution for the Congress, as well, on top of a budget resolution, or as part of the budget resolution.
Senator Conrad?
You know, with the Budget Committee function, I've often thought we should stick with annual budgeting. But the more I am exposed to what actually happens here, I'm increasingly of the view we should go to budgeting every 2 years and spend the other year on performance and oversight. And I think that's a recommendation, if we did it thoughtfully, could carry a lot of weight from this commission. And look, I will confess, I have been opposed to it. I've thought I don't know of any institution of any significant size that doesn't budget annually. But the reality is, we've fallen into a pattern in which we only are doing a budget every other year in any event. And, you know, I was successful in getting one in an election year. You go back to 2000, we've only done it once, where we have gotten a budget in an election year. I was able to do that in 2008. But, you know, you look before and after, it doesn't matter which party is in control. In the election year, we tend not to do a budget. So let's do a 2-year budget in the off year, and let's spend that other year drilling down and doing oversight and doing performance. I think it would help change the whole culture of budgeting in this institution. And I do think that's something we should think carefully about. Obviously, there are others we'd have to visit with other than those around this table in order to get this adopted. But I think it could make a meaningful change in the way we operate.
Congressman Ryan, don't you?
I agree with that. I've been a supporter of biennial budgeting for a number of years. Congressman Henschling and I have it as one of the cornerstones of our budget process reform bill. And Kent, it's the exact same point. Do your budgeting and appropriating in the off year and spend your time doing oversight to see how well the money is being spent in the election year. All we do is appropriate money around here these days. Once we're done appropriating, we go to New Year's, then we start appropriating again. So we just spend all our time spending money. We don't spend our time finding out how well the money is being spent. So that's one of the reasons why I'm a biennial budget fan. Other reason is if we do budgeting or deeming on discretionary spending in the election year, we really up the levels, and that throws our baseline way off. So if anything, you got to obviously have an off-ramp for an emergency in the even year, because things will happen. That's why I think the emergency set aside is appropriate. And so those two proposals, a set aside for emergencies that's tightly defined with a biennial budgeting along with discretionary spending caps, I think gets us kind of where we ought to go.
I just wanted to reinforce this. I've been for biennial budgeting for a long time. I think it has a couple of advantages in addition to those that have been mentioned, namely that the agencies get more planning time because now often they don't get their budget till after the fiscal year has started and it's all very helter-skelter. So if they can plan for a 2-year budget and actually get it on time, it's a lot better. The Defense Department was converted to this at one point and did submit 2-year appropriation requests on the grounds that this would be better for management of defense resources. The Congress resisted it, and on the grounds that they thought it was a loss of control over what happened. Actually, I think you gain control because you can make more changes if you're doing it in a 2-year frame than you can on a very short time horizon.
You know, if I can just say, the problem on defense is they went to a practice of supplementals that really hid the ball from Congress. Yeah. So, you know, you got to find ways to guard against what is the way to get around this. And I'll tell you, we're geniuses here at getting around our own rules. And, you know, you have a circumstance in which you then have an endless supply of supplementals coming through here. And that defeats the whole purpose.
Well, I agree with Ken on many matters, including never underestimate the creativity of the elected official to get around statutes that they have helped write. I do believe, though, that it's important to recognize that really biennial budgeting and performance-based budgeting in many respects go hand in hand. I mean, as we know, what we do around here is we measure the inputs to a program, and we don't measure the outputs. And so if you want to show that you care about the veteran, if you want to show that you care about the elderly, it's all measuring the inputs, regardless of what the performance is. And I will say this also, you know, the only time that we get any kind of oversight around here is when we have bifurcated government, when we have one party in charge of Congress and the other party's in charge of the White House. That's the only time. You know, it should not be used as a political tool. It ought to be institutionalized, and regardless of who occupies the administration, Congress has to do the oversight if we want to get a grip on our budget. But I just wanted to add my voice. Indeed, Paul and I think, have worked on this for 8 years. So far to no avail, but hope springs eternal.
Thank you very much. And we'll go to Ms. Dalton now. Yeah. Congresswoman?
Before we move on, I just wanted to say that I think the big gorilla in the room really is the defense budget, which accounts for 55% of the discretionary spending. And we have so much work to do in order to make sure that performance meets the expenditures, which they don't even know at all when we've discussed this at length. But you know, we need to, I think, especially focus on that. I was on the Government Efficiency Subcommittee of the Government Reform Committee, and the GAO helped us, but every single place that we would shine the light on that defense budget, be it credit cards or airline tickets or whatever it was, there was incredible abuse that the department didn't seem to know about at all.
Well, when the range of contractors you have are somewhere between 1 and 9 million, you know you don't have very good accounting. Thank goodness we do have Senator Coburn, who has provided us a great look into the defense budget, and it's going to be enormously helpful to us when we get down to doing our job. Ms. Dalton.
Thank you. First of all, thanks for the opportunity to be here today to discuss GAO's work on duplication and overlap in federal programs and other cost savings opportunities that we've identified. I head up GAO's defense team, and Pat and I will be sharing this presentation. She'll be coming into the latter part, but I'm going to go through the first set of slides with you. If you could move to the next slide, please. The Commission's role is very, very important, and we believe that GAO's work has demonstrated the need for this effort. For the past decade, we've been doing a lot of work looking at long-term fiscal simulations, and all of this analysis has shown that the federal government is on an unsustainable path. We also produced a report back in 2005 that we called 21st Century Challenges, and this called for the executive branch and Congress to work together in examining the base of federal government. We noted that this effort was needed for multiple reasons. One, demographic trends, changing national security threats, homeland defense threats, global interdependence, and also evolving threats in other areas.
I'm sorry, I know I keep
Sure.
interrupting, but building on Paul's presentation, how can, in your view, how could, because I saw you had some great recommendations in here, how can GAO help to implement that point of how do you measure outcomes and not just inputs, so you get more of a sense for effectiveness of spending?
Right. I
How
think
can
there's
GAO help?
many ways. As you know, we cover the federal government and looking at programs all the time, but it's a multi-pronged problem, and that starts in many cases with the poor quality of the data to begin with. So we point that out, we make recommendations. For example, the Department of Defense, which is the area I work on a day-to-day basis, still has significant financial management problems and issues that have been pointed out, and it's going to be at least several more years before they get some of their financial management systems updated and their data more accurate. It's still a very, very long-term challenge. That's only a piece of this. The other thing that we can, of course, assist with is pointing out and continuing to comment on the quality of the metrics and plans that agencies produce to guide them. There are significant weaknesses there. And then, of course, we go back in and look at how well programs are performing against either their goals or the metrics that have been established and find additional problems and make recommendations to improve there. But going even a little bit further, the work that we hope to be doing, looking more on duplication and overlap, we also want to look at options in some cases for perhaps restructuring or taking some of these issues further than we've taken them in the past.
And same question for you that I asked Paul earlier. Is there any agency that the GAO would look at and say, when you're trying to combine the input, the cost, and you're also measuring quality outcomes, is there anyone that you would look at and say, they're the best of the bunch? I mean, you can argue about that they're not perfect, nobody ever is, but hey, these guys really seem to be doing something, and we ought to try to spread that approach, that best practice across the board.
I don't think we could identify a particular agency at this point. I think we've seen maybe pockets and programs. Paul gave a couple of good examples. But I think we see more pockets, but we also see a lot of challenges in a lot of areas where the quality of the data and the nature of the metrics and the focus on measuring against performance needs to be dramatically improved. To continue, as you know, Congress this year...
I do think that's a big deal, that she can't point to a single agency that's a best practice.
Nobody home.
Yeah.
Again, moving forward, Congress, as part of the Pay-As-You-Go Act of 2010, mandated that GAO identify and report annually on duplicative goals and activities across the government. Senator Coburn was a key sponsor for this effort, and this mandate will enable us to build on our past work on duplication and overlap and identify additional opportunities for achieving greater efficiencies. If you move to the next slide, please. We'd like to cover a few topics today. First, we'll provide some examples of GAO's past work on duplication and overlap and fragmentation in federal programs. We'd also like to summarize some of the other key cost savings opportunities that we've identified in our work over the past several years. We'd also then like to discuss some of the key challenges that agencies and the government as a whole face in trying to reduce or eliminate duplication. One of the problems here is, of course, the increasing interagency nature, a lot of the challenges that government faces, because agencies more and more have to work together to solve key national issues. And then finally, we'd like to talk a little bit about our planned approach to address the mandate on duplication included in the Pay-As-You-Go Act. If you go to the next slide, please. During the past 2 decades, we've completed over 200 reports, as a rough estimate, that highlights the potential for duplication, overlap, and fragmentation in federal programs. Our work has shown that redundancy in some areas can be beneficial if it's there by design, and if it's to either foster competition or provide emergency backup in some areas like defense or critical infrastructure, where a single point of failure could be catastrophic.
I just want to ask you a question. I've asked for a lot of those reports, and they're excellent. Here's the question. You all put out a report that's highly accurate, unbiased, sometimes challenged by agency. What's been the, have you studied your output versus the response by Congress in eliminating the problem? It is an important question, because what happens is we ignore what the GAO says and don't fix the problems. And the reason, have you all ever done an analysis to say, here's all the recommendation we've made over the last 2 years, and what did Congress do to respond to it?
I think, and Pat would want to chime in on this for sure also, but we have been going through that process as part of figuring out what additional work we need to do under this new mandate. And I think, again, it's a multi-pronged answer. In some cases, executive agencies may not have taken action. Some of these problems of duplication overlap may actually be more just an inattention to good management practices and senior level attention. So there's room for improvement there as well. In other cases, it is more complex, because we've found...
But you don't want to comment on how responsive Congress has been to the recommendations GAO has made?
No, I will, continue on that also, because I think in several areas the problems have continued, or the issues of overlap have continued, because they can also involve policy changes. As we talked, Paul mentioned the area of federal higher education, grants, assistance, et cetera. It would take legislative reform to address some of those issues. It involves multiple committees with different jurisdictions in many cases, so it would really take an integrated effort among the Congress to perhaps prioritize and take on a few of these issues. Pat?
Yeah, I think a lot of our follow-up has really been on the executive branch as opposed to the Congress itself. On specific issues, we will comment at times, but we've never done it in total. At times through our regular reporting, for example, every 2 years, we issue a high-risk report to the Congress. We will look comprehensively at an issue and say, what's happened? It's a high-risk area for a variety of reasons. And in that case, we may, in fact, point out that there's been action by Congress, or there's not, or, in fact, it's gotten worse.
Great example. IT contracting.
this country. It's the largest at-risk money we have outside of the Defense Department. A portion of that's in the Defense Department, and over 50% of those projects fail. And yet, has Congress responded to that? No. And so the issue, one of the issues, people don't want to talk about it, is we get great recommendations, but we don't act on them. And the problem is Congress. It's not the agencies. It's not the people who work in civilian federal employees. It's Congress. And I think it'd be very interesting to see from GAO, here's the recommendations we've made the last 3 years, here's how many of them got followed. That's a report card on Congress by the GAO. And I'd love to see that data come, because I think it'd be helpful in us really fixing the problems that ail us.
Can I comment on that? Having requested and been at hearings where the GAO has done incredible work, I agree, except to one extent. I think sometimes the work of the GAO exposed in a committee hearing does force some action by the agencies, but I think it would be wonderful to see when there's been recommendations for Congress to make changes, how many have we really done? I think that would be very, very helpful, because the work that you do, the product is so incredibly useful. The findings and the recommendations are always so helpful if they were implemented.
Thank you.
Thanks. Moving on, as I mentioned, there are cases in which duplication overlap may be appropriate, but our work has shown that fragmentation and overlap are often the result of an adaptive federal government. And what typically happens is, as new needs are identified, the common response has been to layer on new programs, activities, and this, of course, leads to a proliferation of roles, responsibilities, and overlaps among federal agencies. Next slide, please. What we'd like to do next is just talk about a few of the examples from our wide body of work where we've discussed and identified examples of duplication and overlap. And I think these examples illustrate the range of issues that could be included as part of a government-wide process to re-examine the base of federal spending. First, GAO added food safety to our high-risk list in 2007 because 15 agencies collectively administer over 30 food-related laws. This has led to ineffective coordination and an inefficient use of resources. In addition, more integrated planning and coordination, we've recommended that alternative structures for the oversight of food safety be explored and examined. Another example is federal food assistance programs. We typically spend about $60 billion a year in this area, and we've noted that this is through 18 programs that have emerged piecemeal over the past several decades. We've made recommendations to the Secretary of Agriculture to identify and develop methods for addressing some of these inefficiencies. However, this is an area where our work has also recognized that there are trade-offs sometimes in targeting services to specific populations being served, such as the elderly or children. Some of these programs are not, again, food assistance in general, but are more targeted. So these may raise issues, again, for the Congress to the extent that consolidation may need to occur.
What happens, I mean, you know, if there are 18 programs, we're spending $60 billion, and you all make these recommendations that can make these more efficient, more effective, and still meet the needs that the Congress has specified. What happens when you make these recommendations? Do they just go up on the shelf, or?
Well, we do have an active process to follow up in terms of what the agencies are doing with the recommendations. And over time, we report that a fairly high level of the recommendations get implemented. I think one of the things, though, is that we often tailor our recommendations to the kinds of things that executive branch heads can do: improve their strategic planning, better coordination, taking care of some of the better business practice issues that are impeding efficiencies. The more challenging recommendations we make, again, may be where agency heads either have to work together, and that's much more difficult to ensure actually happens, or again, when there are matters for congressional consideration.
She's actually being way too nice. Let me give you an example. The census. GAO said census is in trouble. Census has a no-bid contract on a device that they could buy for 1/5 of what they contracted it for. The device never met parameters. They spent $500 million on a device that failed to meet its mission, and then paid a performance bonus on top of that. They recognized that problem 2 years before it was going to be a problem, and it was denied that it was a significant problem by the leadership of the Census Bureau and the Commerce Secretary under the Bush administration. So they're giving us the information. Is we don't act on it, and the administration doesn't act on it. And I can give you 100 other examples just like that of recommendations that they've recognized, here are problems coming, they're going to get worse. It's just like IT. They keep telling us about IT. We don't fix it.
Is it a lack of time for you all to follow up? I mean, one of the things you all talked about was biennial budgeting, you know, and you'd have time to do follow-up. But again, if this happened in Dave's company and they didn't follow up, those people would be out the door. And you get some people in there who would do the job. What's the follow-up mechanism here?
The follow-up mechanism is members of Congress routinely don't like to do the hard work of oversight. And there's a couple of reasons for it. One is they don't get the attaboy credit at home. You know, they didn't pass a bill to take care of somebody's problem. And so it's much harder work to do effective oversight because you have to understand the issue as well as GAO does, as well as the agency does. Otherwise, you end up with a pie on your face. So there's a general reticence to not do effective oversight.
But it seems to me with a $1.6 trillion deficit and with the buildup of debt we have, and that we've got to operate more effectively or the nation as a whole is going to go broke, that there'd be every incentive now to actually follow up, and make sure the money we are spending at least is being spent wisely.
I'll tell you what it is. We don't prioritize spending. I mean, we just throw it more money on top. That's what Congress does every year. A lot of this is discretionary. And so clearly, Congress has the ability on an annual basis these days to actually address these issues. But when you're just throwing more money on top of every other program, growing everything, when you consider a cut and a decrease in the increase of growth, you don't prioritize, and therefore you don't use these reports and use these metrics to prioritize, you know, functioning programs versus non-functioning programs. If we do caps on spending and force Congress to actually prioritize and use performance metrics to do that, I think we'd get somewhere. But without spending caps, and where we just actually raise discretionary spending every single year, and then we don't open up mandatory accounts but for every 6 or 7 years, that's the kind of government you get, and that's what we've got.
Mr. Chairman, I want to agree but also disagree with what I've just heard. I don't think the issue so much runaway spending. I don't think it's so much that we don't follow the words of GAO and others who do the oversight. It's that we have particular interests, each and every one of us. And when it comes time to take on your interest, I'm okay. But when it's time to take on my interest, no way. And so that's what happens. Think of BRAC, the base closure process, where we finally had to downsize the size of the military. There was not one community that had a base that felt its base should close. I don't blame them. It's in their community. They don't want to see that base closed or all the shops that provided services to all those folks, all that military personnel was based on those military grounds. Same thing occurred with regard to the health care bill. We had every type of interest group come in to talk to us about how they were too important to cut, and it's going to happen again. I hope the GAO has an opportunity to go through the report because they make some very good recommendations, and they also identify areas where we need to cut. To Paul's point, Paul, in the last 10 years, the size of the education budget grew about 1%. The size of the Defense Department's budget grew by over 100%. Now, most of that cost came as a result of, or the increase came as a result of the war.
That's just not the case, Javier.
I'm looking at the numbers right now.
Are you talking about DOE's, Department of Education's budget?
Department of Education, 2001, $40 billion.
10 years.
Department of Education's budget in 2010, $46 billion. Over 10 years, it grew $6 billion. Department of Defense budget, $316 billion in 2001. Department of Defense budget in 2010, $693 billion. The difficulty is this, Mr. Chairman.
Javier, they got a triple-digit increase in their budget last year alone in the stimulus bill.
But Paul, what we're talking about is the cuts that have been taken place within certain education programs and increases in others. When you take a look at the whole budget of the Department of
It
Education,
exploded.
if you take a look at the, well, do you take a look at the numbers in the budget? And by the way, as we found out a couple weeks ago, DOD's budget does not include everything we spend on the military. My point is this, Mr. Chairman, we're all going to use the numbers as we wish. I think GAO, which I think everyone in this room would consider a credible agency to tell us where we can do some good accounting, has identified, I think, some areas where we can really do some true investigation to see where we can try to make this government far more efficient. The reality is that we're going to have everyone who's got a particular interest who will speak up. That's the nature of a democracy, which isn't bad. But let's not fool ourselves into believing that Head Start programs have caused this federal government to go into massive deficit. Where we have the major spending, as I think Congresswoman Schakowsky just mentioned, is in areas like DOD, which are very important, Homeland Security, veterans, and so it becomes very difficult for us to make some of the changes that will give us the savings that we wish to see and provide the efficiencies. But that's why we have to have these very open and transparent conversations, because at the end of the day, we get the accountability from the agencies that can do the oversight. It's whether we, in the political process, have the courage to make the decisions that those people have identified.
Senator Coburn?
Yeah, I think Javier has identified the problem, and the word is parochialism. You know, nobody up here, when they take their oath, mentions Illinois, Oklahoma, North Dakota, Montana, Wisconsin, California. This is an oath. And our problem is we put parochial concerns ahead of the best long-term interests of the country. Now, he didn't say it that way, but that's really what's happened and how we've gotten out of control. And the American people smell that. And that's why it's really important what we do in this commission is we could actually start a trend that would stop that, so that we would all be dedicated, even with our own political biases and our own philosophical differences, to try to be doing the best right thing in the long term for the country as a whole. And the paradox of that is that gets recognized at home based on the valor that what it is. And it's not a negative, it becomes a positive, except we too often are too worried about the next election cycle to really think in the long term. So I think you're on to something explaining what's actually going. We lack the courage of our convictions to do what the American people want us to do.
And it's really interesting. Every single witness we've had has said that what we're doing now is unsustainable. You know, so it's not like we don't get it, but we're going to have to put some of these parochial interests aside and really step up to the real problem. Jeff?
Javier, we may be talking apples and oranges here. I don't have a Department of Education number. I've got an OMB table that says that Function 50, National Defense, over 10 years has increased 136%. In Budget Function 500, the education function has increased 149%. I know that's not the Department of Education per se. It's kind of cross-agency. And again, we may be speaking apples to oranges here, and let's face it, we could zero out both the Department of Defense and zero out the Department of Education, and we still have a massive structural debt that we've barely made a dent in. So, I mean, this is a very useful conversation, and I would love for us to move to any facet of performance-based budgeting. But, Chairman, if I could address one of your issues, and to some extent echo Senator Coburn here, you ask, well, why doesn't Congress, accept some of these changes? Again, it is a cultural focus on the metrics of input. I mean, perversely, if I go and I accept a GAO report or maybe an Inspector General report, I may end up actually saving money for the agency, and then I become liable in the body politic for cutting their funding. The culture does not reward efficiency. The culture rewards inefficiency. And so part of this is changing the culture, and the American people are going to have to help change the culture of Congress. But I do think that's turning, but I've seen it over and over. I mean, all of a sudden, as we know, I mean, just look at when we're speaking of IT, in every aspect of the private market, you know, IT, the cost has gone down, it's become more efficient. But if I found a more effective computer system or IT system for the Department of Education, and it was more effective and I saved 10%, again, I'm liable for cutting their budget 10%. So, that's the answer to the question.
Let me add a note. You often hear me come up with a remarkable anecdote. First of all, if you torture statistics long enough, eventually they'll confess. I learned that in the law practice. If you torture statistics long enough, eventually they'll confess. And you're all right, you're correct. But you remember the Golden Fleece Award? Bill Proxmire, wonderful guy, really was a splendid man and a great friend. I'd go home and they'd say, "Hey, Simpson, what are you doing with the Golden Fleece Award, grazing feeds or whatever, corn, wheat?" So I came back to old Bill and I looked up how much dairy money he had brought to Wisconsin over his entire tour of duty. We're in the elevator. I said, "Bill, old pal, the Golden Fleece Award is very popular." He said, "Oh, they love it." I said, "I have a figure here that you brought this much dairy money back to your state of Wisconsin over your entire time here." "Oh," but he said, "Al, you don't understand. These are little towns. These are towns of 400 or 800 people, and we have to keep them going." I said, "Yeah, but I'm getting fleeced on that one." And old Bill, he said, "I guess I could quit using the phrase." I said, "Well, don't use it on me in Wyoming, because we're all in this huge, bring home the bacon and the pig is dead." I said it before, and the people now who are getting thrown out or will be thrown out are appropriators. What an interesting concept. That's where you wanted to be, the high purple, the crowned royalty of House and Senate, to be the appropriators. Well, I think that game is coming to an end.
Senator, in Wisconsin, we say that milk is thicker than blood. And so he's just living that out. Yeah.
That's true. Senator Conrad.
You know, this conversation, to me, as I've listened to it, and I think this has been a very good conversation because we're really getting to the heart of the culture. Some of all of this is true. Some of all of it. Congressman Bashara, I think, really put his finger on it. Look, as a Budget Committee chairman, I can testify, Paul can testify, there is an interest behind every dime that's in the federal budget. And most of them are well motivated. And the problem is the way it works. You know, let's take education. We all know what's happened. We got a proliferation of programs, all well-intended, and there's almost no coordination. It's probably actually hurting people's uptake and use of the programs because it's so convoluted, so complicated. There's so many contradictions between the application of the programs. Who qualifies? What are the income tests? What are the asset limitations? I tell you, I think if we, as a commission, tried to simplify, recommended simplification, and went right through education, had a consistent set of standards for what it takes to apply and qualify, we would not only save money, because I've often wondered, how much is in the administration of these programs? How much of the money actually gets out there into the countryside? How much of the money gets stuck right here in an agency in Washington? Tom, you are right to raise the issue. We don't know. I've asked the question repeatedly on education programs, how much of this money actually gets out there and how much gets locked up in bureaucracy here, how much gets locked up in bureaucracy at the state level because they take a haircut when we send them money for their distribution, I'll tell you, sometimes I've been shocked to find out the state taking a 20% haircut to administer federal money. I mean, there is a tremendous opportunity for us to make a big contribution here.
Jan?
I would like to actually hear the rest of the GAO presentation. Can we move to that?
Absolutely. I do think before we leave this, I just think it's important to say that the recommendations that this commission ends up making are going to be relatively easy for people like Al and I to vote for, because we're going to gore everyone's ox. It's going to be tough, it's going to be painful, and it's not going to be particularly short-term popular. But we've got to count on those of you who run for public office too. And that means you're going to have to set some of those parochial interests aside and do what's in the best interest of the country, because what we're doing today is simply not sustainable. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have other examples in our presentation, but I'd like to turn for a minute to national security issues, if I could have the next slide, and just point out a couple of examples from our work where we've identified duplication and potential overlap. First, I wanted to focus on some of our work on unmanned systems that's shown that there's potential for greater commonality in sensors, payloads, and that could lead to potential better use of resources. In addition, pardon? Page 7. 6, sorry, 6. For example, also in our work in the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance area, we found that DoD is planning to procure a wide array of different types of platforms and improvements. And as we've looked over their plan for managing this effort, which is into the hundreds of pages, we've seen that it's not often well integrated and doesn't necessarily make it apparent what the highest priority efforts are. One of the issues here is that DoD has been investing in a lot of platforms, but there is also the need to consider the processing capabilities that DoD may need to make good use of the information that they're collecting. Moving on to another area, DoD healthcare. I'm sure you all know that DoD healthcare costs have been rising rapidly. Each of the services still has its own major medical command. Although DoD is pursuing some limited consolidation as part of this latest base closure round, it decided not to pursue more fundamental restructuring in 2007. They had looked at a series of options to include moving to a total unified medical command approach, but there were other options on the table at that point. So again, in light of the rise in costs, we're taking a look now at their progress in implementing the more modest recommendations, but this may be an area that warrants further analysis. Yes.
This is it's relevant, but it's not directly on point. Do you know about the HEAT program, whereas Justice Department and HHS are found about $60 billion of Medicare fraud annually? And so they're working together. Justice is and HHS is, and to try to root out this fraud. And I wonder if you're aware of that. And if you are aware, how that's working and so forth.
I know we've done quite a bit of work in the Medicaid area. My area tends to be more defense, so I'm not familiar with the details of that work. Do you have anything, Pat?
Yeah, I don't have anything specific. As Janet said, we have been doing quite a bit of work in that area, along with improper payments, fraudulent payments across the government.
But anyway, they estimate $60 billion paid out fraudulently every year. Mm-hmm. And there's been about 460, there's a task force, and they've charged 465 defendants with fraud in the last,
I know a number of,
not know a period of
right.
time. My sense is that that's an area in which we can be much more aggressive.
Yeah, we've done quite a
Definitely.
bit of work, and we have identified fairly significant potential for, inefficiencies and in some cases fraud in
And
that area. We
frankly,
can provide some
might,
reports on that.
And the more we do, that's going to also create a better overworked word culture. Because once there's a sense that you can't get away with this stuff, and you're going to be caught if you try to defraud the government, I think that's going to have a salutary effect on a lot of other areas. Thank you.
Erskine, if I could build on a point that both Senators Baucus and I think Coburn have been making, as we're looking for suggestions, Could GAO just pull together a list of recommendations over the last 5 years and what those suggestions are worth and were they done or not? It might be an interesting list for us to have, because everybody comes out saying things can't be done, or we're perfectly administered, our process is perfect today, and that's kind of what's implied as you say, I just need inflation. It might be interesting to just have that list of, over the last 5 years, here's the recommendation, here's how much it was worth, was it done or not?
We certainly could do that.
Okay? Thanks. Actually, I thought you'd argue with me, so I was fully prepared. That was very helpful, thank you.
Actually, on an annual basis, we follow up on all of our recommendations so that we do know exactly what action had been taken or not taken on each of the recommendations.
Right.
Starts to add up.
So, yes.
And again, these are really selective examples of some of the issues we've raised in our reports. Moving on, also, not only DOD, but we've also, if you turn to the next slide, have found instances where the Department of Homeland Security also administers multiple security assessments. They're always looking for vulnerabilities in various transportation assets. They do assessments of ports, assessments of roads and trucking and things like that. And we found that other agencies also perform very similar assessments and that these types of assessments are not well coordinated. So again, that is an overview of just some of the issues we've identified in national security. If you turn to slide 8, we wanted to spend a little bit of time also talking about some of the other work that doesn't necessarily just relate to duplication and overlap, but we've gone through a process and we've actually posted on a website over 30 other areas where we think there's potential to achieve cost savings over time in government through the use of better business practices and more efficiencies. So if I could just highlight a couple and then turn it over to Pat. First of all, again, in the defense area, DoD spends over $300 billion annually on the procurement of goods and services. DoD acquisition practices and contract oversight has been on our list of high-risk issues for many years because of the potential for waste and inefficiency. The administration has focused on this. Secretary Gates has a set of initiatives that could help deal with some of these challenges. But in our assessment, closer review and prioritization of requirements, use of a knowledge-based approach to managing technology risks and cost, schedule, and performance issues, and then increased use of competition and better contract oversight could lead to significant cost savings within the Department of Defense. Next, if you turn to slide 9, we believe similar opportunities for improved outcomes also exist regarding Department of Homeland Security acquisitions and grant programs. In addition to improving its oversight of contractors and demonstrating sound acquisition practices, DHS can improve its management of grants through greater streamlining of some of its programs and standardization of grant administration. So with that, I'd like to turn to Pat.
If we could turn to slide 10. Our work has also pointed to potential opportunities on the revenue side of the House. For example, tax expenditures, preferential treatment in the tax code account for almost $1 trillion in 2009. We list a number of examples of tax expenditures on this slide, and I'll just talk about a couple of them. The first one, the research tax credit. That credit totaled $6 billion in 2005. It's the latest information that we have on that particular credit. About $1 billion, or about half of that, went to corporations that had receipts of over $1 billion a year. In addition to looking at the tax credit, though, you also have to look at all of the other expenditures that the government makes on research across the board. We have direct expenses, grant programs, loan guarantee programs. We don't look at these tools of government in total. They're spread across many agencies. And as I said, they have in some cases, they have very specific uses and intended outcomes, but they're not looked at in total, and they're not looked at in conjunction with what other spending is occurring by the government. And the tax credits are a form of spending by the government. We're giving tax breaks to encourage particular activities. Another one on this list is the ethanol tax credit, which is the third one. That credit was instituted, we believe, to encourage the development of the ethanol industry in this country. At this point, the ethanol industry, the conventional ethanol industry is fairly mature. The intent was to also encourage the use of renewable fuel. Another program that is doing that is the renewable fuel standards that require a certain percentage of renewable fuel be included in gasoline and other products in the country. So we have serious questions about the merits of that tax credit at this point. The revenue foregone is projected to be $6.75 billion by 2015. If I could have the next slide, please. The tax gap is also, we believe, an opportunity for additional savings. Approximately 84% of taxpayers pay their taxes voluntarily and on time. The IRS's estimate, and this is the latest one, has been in 2001, was this tax gap, which is noncompliance with the tax code, costs about $345 billion each year.
More than that.
Okay?
But it was in '01.
Right, and the information we have is the IRS is not going to estimate it again until 2013. It's something that might be what Congress may want to consider having done more frequently. We list a number of opportunities that potentially could improve, close the tax gap through increased enforcement, as well as education of taxpayers. The tax code is very complex, and it can be difficult to comply with. Slide 12.
You know, I don't really care.
It is. Right.
Expenditures, I think tax expenditures are just spending by another name.
It is. And that was to the point of trying to look at, one of the things that happens is the layering of programs, layering of tools, and not looking at them in their totality. And when you start looking at tax credits versus direct spending, the tax credits may go through the tax writing committees of the Congress, whereas the spending is going through the oversight committees and the authorizing committees. On slide 12, we also talk about, this is another potential for revenue enhancement, I would say, on oil and gas royalties. What we have found through our work is that the Department of Energy may not be collecting all that the federal government is entitled to. The monitoring and inspection of production of the federal leases could definitely be improved. Last year, we collected $9 billion in revenue. That does change from year to year. The prior year was about $22 billion. It reflects the price of oil and gas. In addition, Congress may want to consider looking at the royalty rates and our lease terms. Our work in 2008 pointed to that the United States charges some of the lower lease rate royalties and lease rates in terms compared to other countries and even some state governments.
Do you have any estimate on how much money we could have in addition?
We don't at this point, but we certainly could work on that for you. Part of trying to make an estimate is what are the alternatives that you would want to assume. We know what we're collecting. We know what other countries do. We could make some hypothetical assumptions to give you some ideas. On slide 12, we talk about the farm payment programs. GAO's work over the years has found a number of problems, or I'm sorry, slide 13. GAO's work in the farm programs has found a number of issues over the years, and in fact, Congress and the administration have acted on many of them. For example, our work on payments being made to high-income farmers, how disaster insurance is paid for crop disasters. And as I said, the administration and the Congress have taken some actions. But there are other programs. We spend about $6 billion per year on farm programs. An example of an area where there may be some layering here and a need to revisit what a program is doing is the direct farm payment program. This program, we spend about $5 billion a year on this program. This program was established in 1996 in the Farm Bill. It was intended to provide temporary payments that would end in 2002. The purpose at the time was to transition from the dependence on subsidies. It has been reenacted. It is still a current program. Like I said, this really points to one of the things that happens of layering program on top of program and not revisiting an area in total, whether it's education, whether it's farm programs, whether it's, any program in the government, any area in the government you could point to and look at seeing the layering of programs. Slide 14. We talk a little bit here about federal improper payments, and this is really direct spending on by the federal government. The estimate for 2009 fiscal year was that there were $99 billion in improper payments. Clearly a reduction of just 10%.
Do you have a breakdown? Do you have a breakdown of where those improper payments?
We can try to get that for you.
I think it'd be very, very
Will do.
important to this commission. That's obviously a very big number, and if we could get your breakdown of where you think it's occurring.
Okay. And clearly, just in the total, just a 10% reduction would result in some considerable savings for the federal government. We do point out a number of things here in terms of opportunities to reduce the amount of improper payments through improved internal controls, improved program design, as well as a number of legal reforms.
What do you mean by an improper payment?
An improper payment would be a payment that has been made that is not in accordance with the regulations of that particular program. So it could be, for example, someone received a benefit, they did not meet the eligibility requirements.
Yeah, Jan, we've had people get financial aid at the university that weren't really eligible for it. That would be improper, as an example.
If I could have slide 15, please. This is another area that you may want to consider looking at in terms of revenue enhancements. How are user fees being used? It's based on the principle of the user should be paying for the benefit they receive. There's been an increased use of user fees across the government. There may be other opportunities to employ user fees to offset, to be used in place of general fund spending. One point, we list a number of opportunities where federal revenue could be enhanced through user fees. For example, periodically revisiting what the fee is, possibly on a biennial basis so that it is appropriate, changing it with inflation, not having it static, and also looking at what the full cost of government is and trying to recoup that. Oftentimes when we set user fees, they're based on direct costs as opposed to both the direct and the indirect costs to government.
Could I just point out that on immigration, we just raised the fees significantly. There's a question in some minds whether that yields the results that we want, but certainly I don't know why that would be on the list here.
So I think, Congress has been changing things, as well as the administration. That may be slightly out of date. I apologize for that. I'd now like to, on slide 16, try to address some of the challenges that we see in addressing duplication, overlap, fragmentation across the government. I'll run through these fairly quickly because I know we're running short of time. There are a number of challenges that make this task extremely difficult. First of all, it's definitions. We have different views on what the degree of duplication is and the extent to which it exists. For example, we do not have an agreed-upon definition of a program in the government. We all define that slightly differently. We've talked a lot already about developing baseline data. We don't, in many cases, have good data for many reasons. We lack comparable data, the reliability of the data is questionable, and there's difficulties conducting data analysis across agencies, across activities. Oftentimes, when you're looking at overlap and duplication, it will be not just in the Department of Education, but the other programs will be in the Department of Labor, the Department of Veterans Affairs, and trying to gather information across those agencies that you can compare and that you can feel that is reliable and sufficient to make decisions. And also to have outcome-based information. What programs are working, what are not working, as opposed to inputs and process, which we can gather fairly quickly, and we do on a regular basis, but often are missing solid outcome information. Slide 17, please. Another challenge is identifying potential savings versus realized actual savings. Our previous work has shown that program consolidations can lead to increased efficiency and improved performance. For example, program consolidations offer opportunities to reduce federal spending in terms of administrative costs, program costs, or both. However, there are challenges. For example, if you combine programs and don't eliminate the administrative costs, what have you really saved? Oftentimes, we will just combine programs as opposed to truly consolidate them in a financial sense and integrate the systems, the management, the processes of agencies. And this takes a long time to do. And we often have very short attention spans and think it can be done in a year. It often takes much longer than that. Slide 18. Identifying specific solutions can also be a very large challenge. Agencies encounter a range of challenges in addressing duplication. Their missions may not be mutually reinforcing. They may even conflict. Interagency coordination is often hindered, as I've said, by incompatible procedures, processes, data, computer systems. And then you've got this third bullet, sub-bullet here, which I would call turf problems. You've talked a lot here today about turf problems and disjoint within the Congress. Well, there's also turf problems in the agencies, and the agencies are going to be protecting their programs, their resources, and it's important to be conscious of that. While significant gains can be achieved by restructuring outmoded organizations and programs, restructurings can be immensely complex, and clearly they're politically charged. In addition, we have to be conscious of the implementation costs. Oftentimes, as you're consolidating a program, it's going to cost more in the short run to get the long-term benefits, which means that it's important to have an agreement on what's going to be done. And could I have slide 19, please? As well as a very detailed implementation plan. An example of some of the difficulties the government has gone through in the last decade has been the Department of Homeland Security, as it was consolidated from 20-plus agencies and trying to integrate numerous systems, processes, cultures. It is still a work in process, I would say, and we need to recognize that and develop the agreements on the front end as well as the detailed long-term implementation plans for success if consolidation is.
Let me just add that I'm on the Intelligence Committee in the House. We're hoping to get the help of the GAO, which because of national security issues has not, but we think we can deal with that. And one of the things that we need to look at, I think, is that in having created a new the Director of National Intelligence, the Office of the Director. Are we really achieving the kind of coordination and cost savings, et cetera, or have we just set up yet another office in the effort to do that?
Right.
We definitely need your help.
We have-
16 intelligence agencies and.
Right. And one of the issues with coordination is what is an agency going to gain out of it, and structuring something so that there's a mutual interest in ensuring success and ensuring coordination, and that there's value to all of the parties. It's going to take sustained leadership, commitment, monitoring, and oversight. They're keys to success, with holding organizations and people accountable both in the short term and in the long term. Consolidations, elimination of duplication, overlap, and fragmentation is not easy. It takes time, and so therefore it's critical to have that sustained leadership, oversight, and accountability for people.
Yeah, but really this is a place where, having been on the executive side, I can say that Congress really needs to grab a ball. Because you have a turnover in leadership about every 18 months of these agencies. And the new head comes in and they've got their whole new wave, their reforms. And basically the agency just says, I'll wait this guy out until the next guy comes in. And it's not like having Dave Cody, who you know is going to be there for 10 years or 15 years, and you really have to do what they say. And so if you're going to have make these recommendations, making sure Congress has some mechanism to really follow up and make sure that the changes you want made done, regardless of who's running that agency every 2 years, I think would make a big difference.
You know, Erskine, one of the problems that oversight committees have is that change. The new person comes in to testify. We ask the same questions.
Exactly.
And they say, well, I'm new here, and I'm going to make those changes. And by the time we come back and check on it, there's another person there saying, well, yeah, I'm gonna make those reforms, and they don't get done. So you're right.
If I could just, I'm kind of piling on, but building on the point that the two of you made. You look at Honeywell, $35 billion company. There's no way you could institute changes and get them done over the course of a couple of years. Just being there for 8 years and being able to just regularly have that drumbeat, you keep measuring the same stuff, keep driving it, is what over the course of 5 to 10 years really gets you somewhere. You look at the size of these agencies, they dwarf Honeywell. And the idea that somebody can come in 18 months, make it happen, ain't no way. It's I think you've really put your finger on something important on this. How do you make sure that that continuity of purpose, the metrics, that continues to stay, and you don't just keep redoing stuff every 18 months? Otherwise, you do run into exactly that phenomenon, I think, that says, well, we can wait this guy out too.
If I could make a comment on that issue, that was one of the reasons that GAO originally recommended that at the Department of Defense there be a chief management officer with about a 7-year term or so that would extend beyond administrations. Now, Congress, in passing legislation, did establish the chief management officer and a deputy chief management officer at DOD. The chief management officer is also the deputy secretary of defense, so he wears 2 hats there. And so that term would be the normal term. But it was precisely because I think our recognition that DOD had 8 of the 30 high-risk areas across GAO, and then there was a need for sustained focus on some of these issues over time, that we made that recommendation.
Okay, if I could have our next slide, slide 20. I'd like to talk just very briefly about the work that we're doing under the mandate that was in the PAYGO legislation that Senator Coburn introduced. This mandate requires GAO to annually report on duplication across the government, including spending, credit, regulatory, and tax programs. If I could have the next slide, I'd like to talk just a little bit about what that work is entailing this year. Our first annual report will be, we will be reporting to the Congress in February of 2011. We are timing it to be available for the budget cycle, for each budget cycle. And the slide addresses the main things that we will be talking about in the first report. We're focusing primarily on federal programs receiving discretionary funds for this report. We are going to be relying on a lot of our past work as well as some of the work that's ongoing in pulling this report together. We will also be including major cost savings, as I've talked about here. There'll be some updated information. We are in the process of updating what we consider are some of the major cost-saving opportunities across the government. We will also be introducing in the report our future work of where do we think that, where will we be going in the following report. We recognize that we can't cover the entire government in any one year, so we are selecting targets of opportunity that we think will have significant savings potential, and we will be reporting them on a regular basis.
Yeah, I think you will have a target-rich environment.
I think we do. And we are talking with many of the committees of Congress and constructing the areas of targeting, and have welcomed input from all the committees of Congress. And certainly would welcome any insights you all have. Thank you very much.
I really appreciate it, and after the years here, nothing has changed, and I was part of it. In fact, you've hit a nerve right here, and it's going to hit every nerve. It's going to hit me hard, and that's oil and gas, royalties, computation. I mean, you don't think I'll get boulders at my ball dome, but I'll tell you, if anybody in here believes they're going to get out of this unscathed, we're wrong, and we're not really doing our job. So this is powerful stuff, and because oil and gas in my state is our bread and butter. It's bigger than milk. And furthermore, we have taxed the industry with a severance tax on coal and oil and gas because we knew that when the product was gone, they'd be gone. So we have now about $4.2 billion in a permanent mineral trust fund. And when they are gone, we hardy 500,000 people will be living on that. But how many times I was here in the 18 years we cited you, the GAO as the gold standard. GAO tells us this, GAO tells us this, or we have a GAO report, you give that to your constituents, and then we never do anything that you suggest. Nothing, ever. But we have a hearing that the GAO has said this, and everybody perks up. And improving collection of royalties, doing these things. Max has spoken about that tax gap several times. These are real things. And the real problem is Congress, but there's this other problem of down and deep in the bureaucracy, you can outwit them, but you can't outweigh them. You can outwit them by humiliating them, but they'll outweigh you. They'll just say, here comes a new guy, just as we've all said here. But I notice this pay-as-you-go statute says the word shall. That's a different language than I've seen before. And when you get through with the word shall instead of may or hopefully or whatever, I think this first report in February, while they're still mulling around in what we've done, is going to get things off the dime. I thank you very much. Very impressive.
Thank you.
I thought Dave Cody made a terrific recommendation. If we could get your recommendations for the last 5 years, and as we look at ways to reduce the budget, that ought to be the first place we go, not the last place we go. Other comments other questions? Yes, sir.
If I could just add a question about the tax expenditure slide. I don't know which one that was.
I believe it was slide 10 or 11.
I don't quite recall what GAOs, one, I don't believe there's an accepted definition of tax expenditure. I want to know, I don't recall what the GAO definition is, but $1 trillion is even real money by Washington standards.
Mm-hmm.
So what, is this all encompassing of all exemptions, deductions, credits?
Yes,
deferrals?
it is.
Okay.
Yeah.
So of this, what a number of these tax expenditures would probably come under the heading of transfer payments, like the earned income tax credit.
Right.
What percentage then of the tax expenditures could be categorized as transfer payments?
I don't have that number, or I can go back to our tax experts and see if we can get that for you.
And then clearly
Okay.
And then clearly out of this $1 trillion, I would expect two of the more popular exemptions are going to be the mortgage deduction and the charitable. Do you know out of this $1 trillion what that universe is?
I don't have those numbers, but we certainly can get those for you.
It is relatively easy to get there, about 179 of them, and we have them, Al carries them with him all the time. Yeah. Yeah, it's a very distinct list.
Well, if it's 179, it's not that little of a list.
Yeah.
If I could, I mean, there's the top 10, and, you know, the exclusion for health and pensions is the top. And then mortgage interest, those three constitute a good share of those. And, yeah, on state and local deduction. I mean, one of the issues is not just the magnitude, but whether there's any thought of coordination. For example, the low-income housing tax credit is over $10 billion for low-income housing. The HUD doesn't even include that in their annual performance plan, because that's not their responsibility, that's the Treasury Department's responsibility. So it's partly the fiscal thing, and it's partly just the sheer lack of coordination.
I think the other thing you all did quite well is you, as an example, you took housing, and you grouped all of the programs that affect housing. And what people should do is really look at which ones are the most effective to accomplish the goals we want to accomplish. And the mortgage interest deduction is one of the things we do. You know, is that the best way to really meet our need?
Yeah, that was one of the things we were trying to point out, of trying to look at these programs and what they were trying to accomplish and looking that way and looking across the government because you will find programs supporting a particular goal in many different places and also using many different tools, tax credits, as well as grant programs, direct spending, loan guarantees, and you can name it starts, housing is one, research is another, energy programs you will find across the government.
If I could, Chairman, sitting on the House Financial Services Committee dealing with over 90 different housing programs in the HUD jurisdiction, many of which have proven to either been ineffective or demonstrated no results, I would welcome you as a witness to our committee someday to make the point you just made.
Since I plan to be retired very soon, I can't wait. Are there other comments? We thank you for coming. Thank you. When the committee members get back in November, we've got some tough decisions to make. Please keep your calendars open, and we thank you for coming today.
Thank you.